The big scandal on Twitter this week was that everyone found out that the Pope is Catholic. I know, it's pretty shocking, right? But all of this stems from an interview that Pope Francis did with 60 Minutes, wherein he affirmed that humans are fundamentally good. And this threw everyone into a tizzy, claiming that the Pope has denied the sinfulness of humanity, that the Pope doesn't understand Christian theology, and of course, it's nonsense. People are confusing three separate ideas: the sinfulness of humanity, original sin, and total depravity, and finally realizing that not all of the Christian tradition ascribes or affirms all three of those separate but related ideas. So let's take a look at what the Pope actually said in this interview, and then we'll talk about these three ideas and where they fit in the Christian tradition.
La gente quiere vivir.
People want to live. People forge ahead. And people are fundamentally good. We are all fundamentally good. Yes, there are some rogues and sinners, but the heart itself is good.
All right, before we talk about these three different ideas, original sin, total depravity, and the sinfulness of humanity, let's clarify what the Pope actually said in this interview. Because, of course, he's speaking Italian, that's being translated into English, and the phrase that he uses has been shifted into English as, "Some of us are rogues and sinners." A better translation would to be something like, "A little bit of us are rogues and sinners." So first of all, he's not denying the sinfulness of all humanity. He's saying we are fundamentally good because that's how we were created. God creates everything and says that it is good. That's how the story begins in Genesis. And then, of course, there is the fall, which impacts all of us. And because of that, all of us are also rogues and sinners. We make mistakes, we sin, and we need salvation from that. So first of all, there's nothing here in this interview that denies the sinfulness of humanity. That is something that is affirmed throughout the scriptures. Paul says we all fall short of the glory of God, and the Pope affirms that absolutely. So that's the fundamental starting point and the first idea when it comes to sin and the human condition. All of us have been impacted by the fall of humanity, and therefore we all sin. That doesn't mean that fundamentally, at our core, who we are and who we were created to be is bad. That is good. We are the good creation of a generous God made in the image of that God. That is your fundamental identity. You are also a sinner. And that's okay. You don't need to deny one or the other. And the Pope is not denying one or the other. In fact, he's affirming both of those in this interview. What gets complicated now is there are two other Christian ideas that get layered onto this question. The second is original sin. And I did a video about original sin. It's been watched a lot of times. We'll link it in the description below and you can check it out. I happen to think original sin is a mistake, but original sin is also very much part of Catholic dogma. And original sin says that not only are you impacted by the fall and the entrance of sin into the human story, and not only will you therefore sin, but original sin says that you are born guilty for the sin of Adam. Original sin is not saying that everyone sins, although that is also true. Original sin is saying that you are guilty for the sins that Adam committed way back in the beginning of the story. That is not the only way that Christians have thought about that story throughout history, though. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there is a parallel doctrine called ancestral sin. And ancestral sin says not that you are guilty for anything that Adam did, but that you are impacted by it. You are born into a world that is corrupted by sin, and therefore you will inevitably sin. All humans sin. Eastern Orthodox Church affirms that as well, but they do not hold that you are guilty for anything that Adam did. So the first starting point is all humans sin. All Christians affirm that. The second layer is original sin, which all Christians do not affirm. Half of the Christian story has an alternate explanation called ancestral sin, which is that we are impacted by sin, but ultimately we are responsible for our own mistakes and our own sins, which we will inevitably commit because we're born into a world corrupted by sin. Okay, so there's two ideas. All human sin, original sin. The Pope happens to affirm both of those. And so anyone claiming that he doesn't or that he doesn't understand theology is just completely misunderstanding the history of Christianity, because what they are doing is applying a third doctrine on top of those two that the Pope does deny because the Pope is not Reformed. In the Reformed tradition of Calvinism that came around in the 1500s, another idea was added onto these two. We start with the fact that everybody sins. We add to that original sin, which comes from Augustine in the 4th century. And then in the 15th century, we add to that total depravity. And this is the idea that sin has so deeply impacted the human condition, not just your sin, but Adam's sin from the original sin, has so deeply impacted the human condition that you are incapable of doing any good in the world because of that sin until you are saved from that sin. So only Christians can do good in the world. Only Christians can lay claim to having any goodness that is imputed to them by Christ, not that they contain in and of themselves. And this is, I think, a terrible doctrine. It is a very late doctrine. I mean, it's been around for 500 years, but in the history of the Christian story, pretty late. I mean, there was Christianity for more than a millennia before we came up with this idea. But I think it is a misreading or maybe a misapplication of a couple poignant verses that are then held up to the exclusion of so many others. For example, I've seen this one on Twitter this week, people trotting out the line from Jesus when he says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God." Well, that's a very poignant rhetorical statement Jesus is making in a conversation to get the antagonist in the story to question his own thinking. Why is he coming to Jesus, calling Jesus good, and yet at the same time trying to undermine the mission, the purpose, the teachings of Jesus? However, you can't just pull that one verse out, because Jesus will also say things like, God makes the sun and the rain to shine and fall on the good and the evil. Jesus will say things like, don't hide your light under a bushel, let it shine so the world can see your good. These are rhetorical ideas that Jesus is using in specific circumstances. He's not at all saying that no one is actually ever good. He's saying, why are you trying to butter me up in this situation? I know you have an ulterior motive. Now, this goes to all kinds of other passages. We see in the prophet Isaiah him saying that your righteousness is like filthy rags. Again, pretty poignant, a pretty heated rhetorical line that he's using there. But if you look at that in context, Isaiah's not saying you can't do any good in the world. Your righteousness has no impact, no good. What he's saying is your righteousness is not actually doing any good. It is just ceremonial. You're not looking after the foreigner. You're not caring for the widow. You're not looking after the orphans in your community. All you are doing is going through the steps and the motions of religious ceremony. That kind of righteousness is like filthy rags to God. Go, do good in the world, create good in the world, add to that your religious devotion, and God will welcome that in your worship. So again, the point here is not that you can't do any good. The point here is that in this specific situation, Isaiah is addressing the people aren't doing any good. Another one would be in the prophet Hosea, where the prophet says God is so holy that God cannot look on evil. And therefore we say, okay, well, we are all so dirty and evil. There's nothing good in us. God can't even look at us until we're saved by Christ. But the context for that passage is precisely the prophet is upset with God for looking on the evil of the nations and the people that are opposing Israel. The prophet is saying, you are being too gracious. You're not being as judgmental as I want you to. Don't you know you can't look on evil? And God says, actually, I can do whatever I want. I can be gracious. I can be forgiving. I can give people time and mercy if I want because, well, I'm God. And being God means I get to do what I want. So a lot of these passages that are used to prop up or reinforce this idea of total depravity, that there's nothing good about you and there can never be anything good about you until you are saved, are actually taken blatantly out of their own context, where they have rhetorical meaning, where the writer is trying to get something important across. Those passages are incredibly important. We shouldn't ignore them, but we should also understand them in their context. Now, the Pope sits in the middle there, where he does affirm original sin. He thinks that you are guilty because of something that Adam did, but he does not affirm total depravity. He honors the fact that you are fundamentally good. This is how you were created, and he wants to draw more of that out of you in a pastoral sense. Now, I happen to believe that all people do sin, but that we are not guilty for Adam's sin, and that we are certainly not totally depraved. That we have mistakes that we have made, every single one of us, that we need to atone for, that we need to be saved from. But at the same time, we are still fundamentally, at the core of who we are, when God looks at us, we are the good creation of a generous God, that God is desperately working to draw back to God's self and to orient us onto the path of Christ, where we can then actually live out that goodness here in the world, helping to create the kind of world that God imagines everyone could participate in. So first of all, no, the Pope is not a heretic, but also, Pope is not a Calvinist. He is a Catholic, and he holds to Catholic doctrine.